Community and connectedness displace fear. People are doing their best, and if they are offered additional resources, their best would be better. This is one of them that really stuck out to me. We want to look past the feedback to the person and figure out why they're saying what they're saying. It's not always that cut and dry. Welcome everyone. My name is Kim Larson. I am with Luminoso, and today I'm going to be going over the researcher workflow from the beginning of the study to about midway. So we're going to get from the survey design to uploading it into Daylight, and then at the end of the webinar, if you are a Daylight user, you'll have access to this project. And if you are not a Daylight user yet, you can sign up for the Daylight trial and see the data there. We did it, and you can too. There's no real secrets to how to become a text analytics researcher. We're trying to make that as broadly available as possible so that anyone can do it. Reach out to us at Luminoso. We're happy to help. The study that we're using as an example today is with the St. John's neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, and we're doing this with St. John's Neighborhood Association. The St. John's Neighborhood Association is an all-volunteer organization that exists to enhance the livability of St. John's, know the issues, consider and act on them that affect the quality of the neighborhood, take and promote positions on matters of civic interest, inform the residents, be in communication with the residents on events or plans affecting the neighborhood, and generally stay in communication with the other organizations in our ecosystem. The research goal for the scope of this study, we wanted to understand what means of outreach are currently most effective. What are our community's most pressing issues? We have an idea of a lot of issues in the neighborhood. People bring it up regularly, but having a quantifiable biggest issue is going to be really helpful, as well as what solutions might be appropriate for our neighborhood. They may not have universal acceptance, and they may have unexpected consequences that some people may have foreseen. So we want to make sure we assessed those as well. As a researcher, I had a hypothesis what we might be hearing and what I would be looking out for in the study. So I did some brainstorming. Street safety might be something. We have street racing. There's some lack of curb cuts for pedestrian safety. There could be some pollution concerns, from litter on the sidewalk to heavy traffic or industrial chemical concerns. We probably had some poverty issues. We have a pretty noticeable unhoused population in the neighborhood. And I suspect there's also a fear of gentrification. Affordability, like housing, essential services, vandalism, graffiti, theft, and isolation was something that I suspect would come up, especially coming out of the pandemic, and a general fear of strangers associated with the issues above. For the solutions perspective, I was looking for language that may talk about infrastructure, enforcement, housing, volunteering, and general community events. My assumptions going into the study was that community and connectedness displace fear, and that people are doing their best in the circumstances they're in, even if their best is not particularly good. I want to perceive that people are doing their best, and if they are offered additional resources, their best would be better. I also want to recognize that as a neighborhood study, it has the full spectrum of human experience, and that traumatic events take time and effort to recover from. Bad feedback indicates a greater personal need or fear, and it should not be taken as a directive. We want to look past the feedback to the person and figure out why they're saying what they're saying. This study's limitations included time. I am a full-time person here at Luminoso. The survey was delivered by volunteers. It was people after work, on weekends. The SJNA budget is bare bones. Everything was donated. We used a free survey platform, and we also had the challenge of winter with ice storms that kept people indoors. And we also had a limitation of self-selected respondents, people walking around the neighborhood. They would see flyers, and there's a QR code. They could scan it with their smartphone, but that is dependent on them being able to be out in the neighborhood or having a smartphone. And that's not necessarily everyone in our community, especially if we have folks living on the streets. Our strength, however, was that with a volunteer-driven survey, we had passionate evangelists, people who would step out of their way, stay up extra late. And the scope of the survey was intentionally comprehensive. And there was also a sense of novelty. And so people were curious, like, what is this? What is this up to? What's going on here? One of the things that made me really happy about this study is that in the feedback, people recognized in the survey, like, that was an enjoyable survey. That was well designed because it was non-restrictive. It wasn't a list of 5-point evaluation questions. It was prompting open-end after open-end, and people could be as brief or as thorough as they want. And because the survey was novel, People really went to town, and we'll see that in the survey. The neighborhood survey design portion. This is a map of our neighborhood, and the goals that we had, or the things that we wanted to do, is identify some demographics, get a sense of how fair and how equitable the survey response pool was, identify the strengths of the neighborhood, reveal some resonant language that we can be using in our communications. We had some hypothesis testing that we wanted to do. We wanted to jumpstart our action planning and also evaluate some of our key metrics. In the survey, we had 4 real tools in our disposal. We have open ends. We utilize that a lot in Daylight. We have scores that we can use to map with a promoter score, satisfaction score, connection score, checkboxes for non-exclusive activities, and selections for more exclusive activities. One of the things that we talk about here at Luminoso and is very common in research is this idea of having a mental warm-up to the topic. And we decided that demographics, especially with as limited as they were, was a good place to start. In the preface, we stated the objective, we validated the audience, and we also covered what the open ends would be in the following pages, so they understood before starting the survey the scope of what they would see. People with short attention spans didn't read it, but they really didn't have to. People who wanted to be thoughtful, they had that information up front. The next question was, which neighborhood do they consider their primary community? And that was considered exclusive because I had threshold goals for each of the neighborhood cuts. We also want to know how long people have been with the community. Because we're looking for memories and perspectives and advice, I broke it out by housing events. Do they remember only what's happened in the last year? Do they remember pre-pandemic times? And then there's folks who've been here the whole time. They've seen businesses come and go. They've seen the neighborhood evolve more than once. We also wanted to see where our respondents were coming from each section. We put out flyers, we talked to businesses, we went to events, we tried to figure out how do we get people to take the survey and give out a shout out. There was a section of high density, low income housing in our neighborhood. So we organized an event to help meet some of their needs, like there were donated blankets, food gift cards, in exchange for taking the survey to enter the raffle. And that helped bridge some of that extra gap for what does it take for someone to complete the survey. And it wasn't necessary in most neighborhoods, but it was really helpful in that particular section. Our response count as of yesterday looks something about this. We had 550 respondents with the survey fielding just after Thanksgiving, so about 3 months ago. We have a decent breakdown of half the folks having mostly pandemic-related memories, and half of the folks with a identifiable memory pre-pandemic. One of the things that we did not include that I think if I were to do it again, I would like to include demographic information, but that was not included in this study, and it should be included in the future studies. Once they've completed the demographic information, we want to look at strengths from stories. The first question to kind of settle people into the survey that I think had a sense of novelty to it was, what drew you to St. John's and what keeps you here? We are identifying those as our strengths. And they are average answers, and they are pretty robust. People opened up delightfully well. People mentioning years, 15-minute drive to the airport, specific parks, feeling welcome, feeling happy, everything we need, and then defining what they need. Small town feel. People used a pretty broad vocabulary, and they opened up. In Daylight, we look at the top most prevalent concepts, and then beyond that, we have what is unique to this question. And that gives us a shortcut answer where we can see what draws people to St. John's, affordability and walkability, 2 specific things. So this is a good thing to recognize. Like, okay, these are going to be probably our grounding core values. Then we wanted to look at messaging and livability and problem language. When looking at the charter for the organization, we needed to understand, what does livability mean to you? What factors do you consider? And people came in, again, pretty storyful, and they were specific. Affordability, not only for myself, but for my neighbors. Access to cheap food and green spaces, bars and coffee shops. Walkability, high on the list. And it was consistent, and we could dive into each of those dimensions. So for what does livability mean to you, the factors looked like walkability, affordability, safety, and then proximity to specific things like locations and bars, which is a very Portland thing, and would likely differ if we were to do this study in Montana or Nebraska, where perhaps walkability to a bar or coffee shop is not the highest priority. This is unique to Portland. For the problem language, we took a two-pronged approach. So what changes would make things better, identifying the solution first language, and then what changes would make things worse. Police is a polarizing topic in Portland, and we wanted to make sure that we captured that and gave folks the opportunity to say, if someone says, I would like a higher police presence, how much resistance do we have to that solution? Chain stores were another issue that came up in both boxes. So we're going to pair these two together, identify what is the language, and then when we're doing the action planning, evaluate the two side by side and figure out what is the most appropriate solution based on the survey feedback. We had some projection from the respondents based on the reputation of the organization fielding the surveys. Depending on who you're doing the research on behalf of, be cognizant, because a survey like this feels like a conversation, and people are projecting a persona or agenda on the survey itself. It's not necessarily innately going to be bias-free. We also want to do some hypothesis testing. I had the idea that connection displaces fear. And so on this section, we asked, how connected do you feel in the St. John's community? I like to sandwich the questions together because the people who follow the assignment will answer both pieces. And then the folks who want to take a shortcut, who are more prone to survey fatigue, just address the one that gravitates to them. And as long as they're answering in Storyful feedback, we get some pretty good results. So because we paired the driver with the open-ended question, we got to use drivers. So if they mentioned volunteer, on average, the people who used that term, they felt more connected. They had a higher connection score than people who did not mention volunteering. Makes sense. It's a proactive action. A more passive form of connection and closer to the average is the folks who attend the farmers market. They're not necessarily going out of their way to become connected, but they passively feel connected, and it's a higher volume mention. Beyond that, we have folks who don't feel as connected using the term interact, and we see it's a very low volume term, only less than 10 responses at the time of the screenshot. And that was interesting because people who are scared to leave the house, who don't feel connected, they're not necessarily volunteering or going to the farmers market, because their fear is if they leave the house, they'll have a poor interaction, and the issues that if they leave the house, their home is unguarded, and their home may be at risk as well. So they stay home to keep themselves and their property safe. Then we have action planning. So we wanted to figure out walkability and how that could impact the local businesses. What do we need to do here? So we have these non-exclusive behaviors of how do you prefer to dine in St. John's? How do you prefer to shop? And then the exclusive option with an other escape hatch is how do you visit the St. John's Business District? Followed by a behavior projection question of if there were decreased car traffic, would you spend more or less time there? The open-ended question of what is St. John's missing? Be specific. This question specifically for a neighborhood has the potential for huge economic implications because it is surfacing that supply and demand curve of there is a demand for these things, and we can quantify how many people are bringing these things up. And people went to town. They had opinions. People were talking about business opportunities, person on the left, bowling alley, bike shop, performance berries, public transportation issues. They want to be able to get to downtown faster, roundabout, ice cream shop. And some people had a specific mindset where they were brainstorming solutions to a specific problem. So if someone was thinking about food or things for teenagers to do in that gap between I'm staying at home, like I can leave the house alone, but I'm not old enough to go to a bar. What do we have those kids? What opportunities do those kids have? And people had a mindset around it. The clusters were really clear and distinct. We have language that we can pass off to the Department of Transportation at the city level, the state level, with really specific examples of we need crosswalks here, we need curb cuts here, we need these forms of public transportation. And then we had things for the private sector as well. Examples like the bowling alley. Trader Joe's came up in every section of the neighborhood. Those answers correlate with whether or not they are pedestrian going to these locations. If they're talking about infrastructure and vacant buildings and bike shops, they would spend more time at our local businesses if there was less car traffic. Folks who would maintain similar habits or go to our business district a little bit less mentioned gym and fitness. Reflections and satisfaction. If we talk about experience being a comprehensive study of reflective and projective behaviors, We wanted to capture that reflective experience. And so we experimented with an emotion grid that we've referenced in previous webinars, where there's 100 emotion words with a linear scale of pleasantness and unpleasantness with high and low energy. And it gives us these 4 quadrants. For people to select their responses, they would choose the pleasantness level and then the energy level. For the more specific breakdown of the elements, safety and livability, local businesses, events, schools, and library, they got to pick which emotion best reflected their experience towards it. And we could see where the positivity and the reservations existed. And we broke it out by neighborhood. So we could see which neighborhoods were most upset, most passive, most sad. For the emotion grid, all it takes is a quick pivot table. We got to see that we were getting a wide spectrum of experiences in our data. We weren't restricted to those high energy positive folks. We got some passive folks, some depressed folks, some high energy angry folks. And those are all really important to get a comprehensive perspective on what our neighborhood means to the people who are part of it. And then we wanted to reflect on how are you going to remember this experience in 2-10 years from now? How are you going to remember this place? And that's where we start to see where trauma doesn't fade as easily as some of the positive memories. We got the full spectrum of human experience in here. On the left, we have people mentioning the parade, gatherings, neighborly kindness, the jazz festival, proposing to their spouse. And we also got some really intense traumas. This is one of them that really stuck out to me because it was traumatic. Like the person's name, they remember the police responses. And it's a thing that will come back time after time. And one of the things that we recognize as researchers is when we're taking on challenging topics, things like this can really stick out as like, oh, this must be a terrible neighborhood. One person has a really bad experience and was willing to share it with us. Does that make this a bad neighborhood? It's not always that cut and dry. So when we use an AI, it's cataloging all of those memories without that bias towards the negative that we have as empathetic humans. So here we have the memory clusters of social events, parade day, jazz festival, tree lighting, Halloween. These are accessible events to a large part of the community. We also have some local businesses that are mentioned, like coffee shops and Slims and the Beer Porch and Ace Hardware and Lombard House, all these really specific things that there is no way as a researcher I was going to build an ontology for every event St. John's has ever had in the residents' memory, every business that we've ever had, all the streets. There's no way. The AI needed to read that data for me and build that for us. There's still the negative memories in there, but we can see where it is relative to those other mentions, where we see shootings, shook, unfortunately, thankfully. One of the things that I like about daylight is the clustering of these words are intentional. It's words that are used synonymously or in conjunction with each other. And we did see that in the survey. When people were talking about those traumas, they found a silver lining in these negative memories. We couldn't have gotten that rich level of insight if we hadn't asked the question the way we did. The common approach to satisfaction of questions are 1 to 5 star rating, explain why you gave the rating the way you did. We may have gotten very different answers and they wouldn't be this specific and heartwarming and tragic. If we view CSAT and experience as a reflective internal experience, recommendations and promoters is how do we perceive others? Most of us are familiar with the idea of imposter syndrome and gatekeepers. So imposter syndrome is I'm not satisfied, I had a hard time, but I'm sure the product or the service in the neighborhood is good. Someone else might really like it. That's our imposter syndrome. There's also the gatekeepers who have a more inflated sense of ego than the imposter syndrome folks, where they may say, I could do it, but no one else could. This is tough. It's not ready for prime time. We want to make sure that we're capturing both because the feedback from each perspective tells us if we're actually moving forward. We need to be working with both levers so that people are satisfied and recommending. One does not displace the other. We asked, how strongly would you recommend the neighborhood to others? Everyone stay away, everyone has a place. And then what advice would you give to a new neighbor? What should they do to make the most out of living here? And is there anything they should avoid? By packing it together, some people were really like, I don't think there's anything that people should avoid. Everything's pretty fine. And some really focused on the avoid with very few positives, but it gave us this robust perspective. So advice to new neighbor included go to the parks, here's where you go to hang out, this is where you go grocery shopping, try the wings that you're in, Daydreamer Coffee, Lombard House, walk to the food cart. Some gunshot stories that may be different from if we did a standard recommend question on like, would you recommend the neighborhood? Why? You don't get those same memories. This view really made it clear that the AI was able to figure out, based on the context of the stories, what things were. Lombard House is a bar, Lombard is a street, and it clustered those things accordingly. So using that driver's analysis again, people who said everyone has a place here mentioned beer porch, welcoming, downtown, shops. They also used the word avoid. People who had the perspective of everyone stay away were mentioning self-protective measures, and in that middle ground, lock your car, lock your doors, get cameras. But one of the things that popped out to me as a resident here is that Fessenden was associated with everyone has a place here. If you're familiar with St. John's, Fessenden is not usually that positive. So when we use concept level sentiment, that lets us catch what are the big problems. And what we find when we dive into Fessenden is that Fessenden is not driving those positive scores. Instead, it is associated with the avoid language for folks who live in the other sections of the neighborhood. Some people talk about, we have Taqueria Flores and Daydreamer Coffee, and they're great. But the street itself is not actually getting positive attention. We have to be pairing sentiment with drivers together to get the truth. And then finally, after all that survey and all that fatigue, there's that overflow event. If I forgot to ask something, this is the opportunity for folks to tell me that in this final thoughts and feedback. The email address and how they would like to get more connected, give some closure. If someone learns, like, maybe I do want to be more involved, we gave them the opportunity to take that action here. We're going to upload the file to Daylight. Here is the file. We have 552 surveys file. Download into Excel. Yep, save it in my downloads. Pop on over to Daylight, new project. Going to drag and drop our file there. We're going to upload it in English. And with the new upload page, for folks who have done Daylight before, you remember we used to have one text column. We've finally made survey upload a bit easier so that we can just drag it with respondent-spaced rows. We can skip that because we don't necessarily need that for the public data. Becoming St. John's, we have our connection question, our energy question, our feeling questions. We're going to scroll down and check our work. We're going to configure. Becoming St. John's is a good question label. Strongest memory. Go ahead and upload it to the public space, and you guys can see it as it happens. If you're an active client, you'll see it there too. And we have almost 4,000 essays that we're going to go through. To summarize, we want to make sure that we're going over our goals. How do we get folks to communicate their needs? Asking for stories, asking for explanations helps a lot. We want to make sure that we are identifying what our key metrics are. So if you're doing promoters, consider whether or not it makes sense to also include satisfaction scores as we look for that full experience perspective. The questions that we used are, what advice would you give to a new person in your position? This could be a new employee, someone who's looking to fix the same problem as you have, and how you remember it in the future. 1 to 5, 0 to 5, 0 to 4. I was still figuring out what I wanted and what made the most sense. And the pleasantness was 1 to 10. I really could have simplified that grid. Not everyone is familiar with the grid. People who thought of their emotion first and then tried to find it had a much worse time than the folks who ballparked pleasantness and then ballparked energy to discover their words. The thing that I think would have been simpler is to directly translate to what I wanted to know. Do people feel mad and energized to change things? Are people energized to do more? In a future study, I think I would also want to do prioritization tests and identify key locations to figure out which intersections should be the priorities. How do we feel about it? How often do we traverse this section? What are our impressions of it? Because when you're taking a survey, sometimes it's easy to forget the different elements or features of the product, service, experience, etc. If you are a client, feel free to reach out. If you're a prospect and you're interested in these insights or the neighborhood survey, you want to do something similar, again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help, and I will see you all next time.